Thanks, Acting Premier. So just a quick update on the new 6 cases today. Of the new cases, one is linked to Stratton Finance, has been in quarantine for their entire potentially infectious period, so no new exposure sites from that individual. One individual is linked to Brighton Beach Hotel. They've been staying at their home in Anglesey, and therefore there are a number of exposure sites in Anglesey which have been posted online. As you know, we've got a network of local public health units in Victoria who really drive our work at the moment with contact tracing for COVID, and I've got a great deal of faith in the Barwon Public Health unit, who know the area very well, who've responded through 2020 to colic outbreaks and really as many numbers as some other jurisdictions in Australia have dealt with. So there's a great deal of expertise and local understanding. I've got enormous confidence in them managing this situation. One case is an individual from Victoria who holidayed in Jervis Bay with his family, and the Department of Health advised Victorians last night on that. And of course, New South Wales Health have advised on the relevant exposures in their jurisdiction. His family have also tested positive. That's a spouse and 2 children, making up the remaining 3 new cases. Those 2 children attended North Melbourne Primary School, so that school is closed and contact tracing is underway. And we're still investigating who the index case or first case might be in this family, and indeed how they've acquired it. That's not absolutely clear at this stage because there's no crossover with known exposure sites from the initial interview. As we've discussed this week, this variant of concern is starting to show up in places where normally it would be less likely. So the Brighton Beach Hotel, that was an outdoor dining setting, well ventilated. You wouldn't expect transmission to occur. We still had it as an exposure site. We still informed people to test and isolate until returning a negative. But in fact, all of those people will need to be in quarantine because transmission has occurred there. That's not something that we routinely see, and we didn't routinely see it in 2020, but we have to bear in mind that all the variants of concern now are really a step up to some degree. This Kappa variant, as it's now called, is not the most infectious, but it is more infectious than anything we saw in the beginning and middle of 2020, so we have to bear that in mind. At least 1 in 10 current cases have caught this virus in those casual contact settings, so not the workplace and home close contact settings where we know and expect transmission to occur. I have described it as an absolute beast because we have to run it down to the ground. There are a dozen countries that had no community transmission going into 2021 that have now lost control, that have community transmission and will probably not bring it back to a point where they've got no community transmission again. We have to take a path where we drive this virus back down completely so that we can get control into the longer term. The fact that we're seeing transmission in some of these casual Tier 2 exposure sites or even Tier 3 exposure sites means that we have to re-examine those sites. We have to reach out to people in some of those exposure sites and ask them to quarantine rather than just test and isolate because of the more contagious strain. Again, I'm not giving it magical qualities. I don't need to overplay the danger here. With 150 million cases globally, with 3.5 million deaths, with probably 1 to 3 million deaths just in India in recent months, with the gross underestimation in many countries of the number of true deaths that have occurred, it's absolutely clear that we need to run this completely to ground to be happy that we can open up appropriately. We can't let it get away. We can't go to settings where it would move unchecked with huge numbers of people exposed. So we've got restrictions on for another week to limit the number of unique close contacts that people will have and contain this virus as we did last year so successfully. Thank you.
It's semantics to a great degree, Rich. We've talked about aggressive suppression in Australia or effective elimination. It's the same thing. It's driving community transmission back down to 0. Well, it's absolutely with a view to getting completely on top of it and having no community transmission grumbling along. We can't have 1 or 2 cases out there and then open back up to the kind of settings we had before. That's what led one case from South Australia to lead to 60 cases and thousands of primary close contacts within a month.
So there's a chance that this lockdown could get extended further if we do still see 1 or 2 cases this time next week?
No, we will review, as we always do, on a day-by-day basis. I have great confidence that we'll be able to go to ease settings after the end of next week.
What indications do you need to see in order to make that happen?
Well, obviously I expect that people will be in quarantine as they're identified as new cases now. In large part, that's a real rationale for a lockdown, that everyone is at home to the fullest extent that they can be, and therefore if they are incubating this virus and become symptomatic and get tested, they've not exposed anyone else. Pre-lockdown, each and every one of us has on average about 100 close contacts, unique close contacts. When we're all moving around that much, if we're transmitting to other people and they all have 100 close contacts, that is hugely exponential transmission of this virus. So the lockdown is to make sure that we see cases who are already quarantining, like one of the new cases from overnight. I'd love to see cases driven down to 0 by virtue of that, but if the number of exposure sites stabilise and we're really not seeing new or concerning exposure sites, that gives us all great confidence that we can ease up.
Numbers have not exploded. Contact traces yesterday said they're meeting every key benchmark. Vaccinations are up. We're hitting record testing levels. Melburnians aren't doing their bit, and numbers have not gone up exponentially. So what's the concern here?
So we have managed that exponential growth unmitigated. So I've talked about the R0 for this virus. It might be 5. That means if you're not altering your behaviour, if you're not doing contact tracing, every person passes it on to 5 others. Clearly that's not happening here. We're chasing down every single case. We're chasing down their primary close contacts. But we've seen a growth of probably a dozen primary close contacts for that first case to thousands upon thousands. Those are individuals who could become positive, and we're seeing individuals where we don't know how they've acquired it. That means there are people out there, potentially, probably, who have it and who are not aware that they're infectious. So we need the number of contacts that each and every person across Victoria has, Melbourne in particular, to be limited to just a few people and not 100 people.
Can you just explain that 10% of people who've got it in an unusual situation? How do you compare that to last year? You had hundreds of missing cases last year. How can you actually say this is worse than that?
So certainly through the Blackrock outbreak, the Holiday Inn outbreak, where we were able to track all of those primary close contacts, we didn't see that number who were transmitting in those casual or very short-lived exchanges. They were overwhelmingly in the work and home and prolonged contact situations. Through wave 1 and wave 2, no, we didn't have that level of detail, so it's hard to say. But we know that these viruses, these variants of concern that we're dealing with now, are more transmissible. We know the secondary attack rate, the number of people within households, the number of people within workplaces who end up getting infected is much higher than for the original wild-type virus. So it's more infectious, and it shouldn't surprise us if it's happening in casual settings.
Can you just explain that right in the hotel case, how you think that happened?
So we think that there was an infectious case who was dining there outdoors. This new case from overnight was also dining with a group of other people. They've all tested negative, but this individual has tested positive. They were outdoors, or they were in a well-ventilated, shaded but effectively ventilated setting, but nonetheless transmissions occurred. Now that will happen. We know that ventilation is a great risk mitigator, but it's not going to do the whole thing when you've got a really contagious variant.
Just on the fleeting transmissions, Catherine Bennett said today, in the Kilmore outbreak, Blackrock outbreak, we know that there is airborne spread among people who are in the same indoor setting at the same time. Is there any evidence that for any of these 4 or 5 cases in the last week, that people who were in the same indoor venue at a different time are being infected, or are people there at the same time? And if that's the case, how is that getting
this transmission?
Well, certainly, as I've just said, we're seeing a greater proportion of our total number of cases arising from transmissions in those casual or more fleeting exchanges. We do have a suspicion that there's been transmission 2 hours after an infectious case has left an indoor enclosed space. They were there for a substantial period of time, but they had left 2 hours before the next exposed individual came in, who's become a case. Now that's in the kind of measles category of infectiousness. It probably relates to an unventilated setting where someone spent a great deal of time, but to come in 2 hours later and be infected, look, it might be on surfaces, but it could absolutely be through airborne transmission as well because of that indoor setting.
Given the level of uncertainty about the potential novelty of this type of transmission, do you think it was fair and reasonable yesterday to use the kind of language that you and Jerome used that was quite a heightened level of language, and use it again today in terms of people might die leading transmission? Do you think the tone was right yesterday, or do you agree with some epidemiologists today who said that they were a bit baffled by the language?
Oh, I can't comment. I haven't heard those comments. I'm just speaking to the reality. I've said it's not the most infectious variant of concern out there. It is not at the same level as the wild-type virus that we saw in the early part and middle part of last year. So it's a more concerning, more contagious variant. It doesn't do magical things, but it is fair to say that we're seeing transmission through those fleeting exchanges, and maybe where the infectious case has left the space and another person has moved into it. That's concerning enough.
Just one more on the extension. How crucial in your thinking is the intention to get all those people who are at the Clarendon Street, the Bay Street, the Epping Shopping Centre, these places where fleeting transmissions occur? How keen are you to make sure that every single one of those persons people gets tested before you reverse the lockdown? Is that one of the fundamental underpinnings?
We know we don't get 100% of people necessarily. There'll be people who haven't checked in, who just can't be identified. But when we get back hundreds and hundreds of negatives out of those settings, and it's 80, 90, 95% of everyone who's attended or we think's attended, that's very reassuring. So no, I don't expect 100%, but I'd like to see very high returns on those primary close contacts testing negative.
So you're saying right now that you're seeing evidence of transmission that you didn't see during Victoria's second wave. Couldn't that be down to improvements with contact tracing, which is providing better mapping of how the virus is moving around the state this time around?
Yeah, I've just answered that to Raf, essentially. So we couldn't see that granularity of detail through wave 2 in Victoria last year, but through the Blackrock outbreak, the Holiday Inn outbreak, we haven't seen that proportion of cases who are describing a transmission that's fleeting. I don't want to overemphasise it. We still know that most transmission happens in the household. We still know that it happens in these prolonged and indoor settings. We still need to have a lockdown to minimise the number of people who will be in those settings. That's a key feature of extending this by a week. So it's not that all transmissions are occurring in casual settings. It's just to illustrate that the contagiousness of this virus is not insubstantial.
So these types of transmission...
Sorry, one at a time.
So more of a follow-up on that. So if you're
Take a ticket and sit down.
Sorry, that type of transmission could have been happening during the second wave. You just don't know about it.
Yeah, it could have been transmitting during the second wave. It probably was. I don't think it was happening to that extent. And in the granular examination of transmission with these new variants of concern compared to other variants and compared to the wild type last year, they're seeing greater contagiousness. They're seeing it take over as a variant. That's why it became, B117, the alpha variant, became the predominant one across all of Europe and North America. It's why the Delta variant is now overwhelmingly the variant in India and becoming the predominant variant in the UK. The variant we're seeing now may or may not go in that direction, but it's of concern.
So is it not just the case that authorities are on top of it, contact tracing is working well, it's more that we just don't want to go out on the weekend and lose all the ground with mates?
We are pulling up neck and neck with this virus, no question, and the contact tracing work that's been done has made a huge difference in controlling that exponential growth. But as I say, there are 5,000 plus close contacts, all of whom are at risk of becoming cases, and there are others out there who we're still identifying who don't know where they got it from. So there are unrecognised chains of transmission that contact tracing can't manage because they're not known to anyone. So it is through lockdown and the number of unique contacts that they have that will manage that. That's why Avalon shut down in Sydney. Pre-lockdown, they would have had 100 close contacts. Afterwards, they had 4 or 5. That makes a huge difference.
With most of the cases then still being in primary close contacts, but not all, what's your feeling on the impact that contact tracing has had versus the lockdown has had now? Because obviously if contact tracing is working and all of these people are already isolated, then lockdown has less impact, but kind of can't be seen over just a week. So what's your feeling on how we've got to where we are with the 2 triggers?
Yeah, I think contact tracing has done all the heavy lifting to this point in time, almost all the heavy lifting to this point in time. For the cases that are emerging now, that are becoming positive now, it's clear that being in lockdown over the last number of days and for the following days will make a huge difference. We'll see people who simply haven't had a number of close contacts, and so it'll be so much easier to be able to run down those chains of transmission, because it'll be the immediate household contacts only that we'll need to check, and maybe for some essential workers. So that makes a huge difference in terms of running this down and getting ahead of it.
So was 7 days ever going to be enough to test the impact of the lockdown?
No crystal ball gazing is possible in advance of this. What's played out has played out. We didn't know that we would see it introduced into an aged care facility. We don't know that someone who's incredibly infectious just sees their immediate family, or goes to a nightclub, or goes to a dining setting with many other people. And so a week, fingers crossed, could have been absolutely enough. But we've seen an explosion in exposure sites, and we need to bear that in mind in extending it.
The last second wave was a trigger of 5 mystery cases on average over 2 weeks, and less than 5 nominal cases per day. By next Thursday, do you want to see no mystery cases and be very confident, at least in your thinking, that there are no mystery cases out there?
No fixed thresholds. All of those factors are factors that we consider. Clearly, we're doing rings of control here that make a difference. More comprehensively than has ever been done before. So, I wouldn't be concerned if we've got lots of primary close contacts, but they're all quarantining, they all turn positive and they don't generate new exposure sites. That's a key feature here. No, not at this stage. So there seems to be, some general movement in the same areas, but no definitive crossover with exposure sites. So another one of those examples potentially where casual contact, where you can't identify the immediate close contacts, means that we don't know exactly where it's come from.
Do you need a ring of steel this time? Do you need a ring of steel?
Oh, we need some restriction of movement between metropolitan Melbourne and regional Victoria. That will be managed through patrols and compliance. It won't be managed with the kind of roadblocks that we've seen previously. We know that people who are highly motivated to break the rules will have a go anyway. They'll be tracked down through roving patrols and the work of VicPol. They will also be managed by a highly motivated regional Victoria that does not want people outside of the region who are not entitled to be there to be coming and accessing services or events.
But do you need the police to stop it?
No, that genomics will be worked through today. I presume it'll come through either very late today or tomorrow.
Yeah, and so that you, I guess we have now
Yeah, so this family are all connected, but one of them will be the index case in that family, and we don't yet know how they're linked to the rest of the outbreak. If we get the genomics back, and as I expect, because New South Wales doesn't have community cases, it's linked to hotel quarantine in South Australia, then that'll tell us that it's been picked up in Victoria, but we need the detailed epidemiological link to give us the assurance of how it's related.
Just to clarify, so we have 2 index cases where we show the knowledge of virus.
That's right, that's right.
But has there any cases for food, is it that as well as that Woolworths
So none attached to Woolworths Epping North for that exposure day and site. Nothing out of the footy, and we've done pretty extensive contact tracing for those. Again, there might be some people who we've SMS'd who are yet to come through and test, but the immediately seated individuals we followed up very closely. We've got lots of negatives back. Our interstate counterparts have chased up those who've come from interstate and also tested negative, so pretty good assurance that no transmission at the footy.
Do you understand why it's confusing to get the public
This virus is passed on by a minority of people to a huge number when someone's infectious. So most people don't transmit to anyone else. A minority of people transmit to 5 or 10 or 15 or 20. That's the danger. So there'll be some settings where you'd expect transmission to occur and that individual just isn't infectious. And some other places where you just don't expect transmission to occur, but you've got a very infectious individual. I don't know. Obviously, we've always just worked on a day-by-day basis. I think it's very encouraging that in the last 48 hours, we're increasingly seeing people who are at home already, who have not been out and about, who've not got new exposure sites when they get diagnosed, and their entire infectious period has been spent at home and in isolation. That's terrific news. Oh, there's no clear number. It's increasingly the case, and it depends on the mix of vaccines that you're using in a country, and we'll get better understanding of the vaccine efficacy as time goes by. But something like 75% of the adult population getting covered with a vaccine is a pretty good indicator that you really drive transmission down. That's what's coming out with a number of different vaccines. So the priority vaccine list is a Commonwealth decision, or it's a national decision. Who have always been a 1A priority group, and we are just giving support to the feds in order to make sure that they're getting vaccinated at the rate that is appropriate for them, because they have been left behind here. They've got a very little vaccination coverage where they remain a vulnerable and at-risk population. So we're supporting getting them vaccinated as a priority group. But in terms of teachers, and look, there are lots of essential workers, there are lots of potentially exposed individuals that we'd love to all get through our vaccine program. We're at very high numbers in Victoria, better than anywhere. 20,000 a day is terrific, but it is a national decision on priority groups. Teachers who are already eligible by virtue of age, I'd encourage them to come forward and walk in where they can, otherwise book.
There is a mistake. Sorry. The other question was, did the gap
Look, it's really an equity issue with their regional counterparts. We don't want any kids to be left behind here, and I think it's a manageable risk. Nothing is zero risk. I think it's a manageable risk. Those students will be wearing masks. I'd like to remind them that they need to wear them all the time, except when eating or drinking. They should try and make their way to school on their own, not get lifts with other parents. And to make sure they wear their masks on public transport or otherwise as they're getting to school. So I think that's manageable, but it is important. It's a really critical year, and I'm sure the Minister for Education can speak to how critical it is for them.
Just briefly, there's some people in the state Liberal Party suggesting that the virus didn't actually come from hotel quarantine in South Australia. It might have come from someone who didn't do hotel quarantine in Victoria. Is there any doubt in your mind that it's come from South Australia hotel quarantine?
No doubt whatsoever. And no one in South Australia or in public health is disputing that. Look, I don't do the genomic reports. It's done at the Doherty Institute. Whether that's publicly available, I'm not sure.
Can regional use
Regional?
in regional areas?
No, so there are some higher risk settings that remain closed in regional Victoria for the week ahead.
I'm just going to Richard's vaccination question. Have you all achieved the pay is the question of if we have say 40 or 50% vaccinated and all the vulnerable cohorts vaccinated, has there been any discussion about whether we allow at some point later this year the virus to spread and to move away from this aggressive suppressive strategy if we're confident that everyone who is vulnerable has at least had a chance to get vaccinated? Or will this be the action taken until we reach that 75%, which could be next year?
So there are ongoing conversations. They're not landed. We'll continue to look at the modelling and those deliberations will be presented to National Cabinet. It's not just for public health to be making decisions in that area. I would say it's one thing to cover every vulnerable person with an offer of a vaccine, but that doesn't necessarily stop hundreds of thousands of people getting infected. Long COVID is still a significant issue for people. People are disabled by long COVID. People can carry neurological, neuropsychiatric, respiratory and other organ damage for months and months. And so that shouldn't just be set aside as a non-issue. And it shouldn't be set aside that there are people who are not, classic vulnerable groups who are who do not have pre-existing illness, who still die from coronavirus. So we have to bear in mind the kind of scenarios that play out with modelling with 40-50% coverage versus 70-80%. We haven't finished in all of those rather complex discussions. There's lots of modelling. It'll be continue to be informed by a deeper understanding of the vaccines and their coverage as time goes by. I have to bear in mind that the vast majority of Victorians remain entirely vulnerable from an immunity point of view. Only 1 in 1,000 Victorians have had COVID, or 1 in 1,000 Australians have had COVID, so that's no natural immunity coverage at all. There's a couple of percent of Victorians who are fully immune by virtue of having 2 vaccines, so that doesn't protect us sufficiently.
What's the snapback we get back in? Will there's one discount putting on that week, will we have to put in that?
Early days, Rich. I wish I could crystal ball gaze. We don't know what tomorrow will bring, let alone a week, 10 days from now. We're all hoping for the best. I think the trend is good. As I say, the last 48 hours are seeing more and more people who are not infectious in the community. That's a really good sign.
Why is the government's QR code system only being made mandatory in supermarkets and retail outlets now, and how are we going to enforce that?
So it'll be enforced through the supermarkets knowing that it's a really important measure. We've always recommended it as an important measure, and in places where it's mandated, it's not always complied with. So all of those elements of information, education, supporting people, and having an app that's really easy to use, like the Service Vic app, that'll be terrific. But the supermarkets are highly motivated to do the right thing, and I know the CEOs of the big chain supermarkets are ready to go with overseeing to make sure that check-ins are happening exactly as we'd like it to happen.
It's already been recommended before. Why will it be any different this time? How are we going to make sure that businesses are complying with this?
Look, I think we're in a position now where the Victorian community is motivated to do the right thing. They understand the importance of contact tracing in this space, and even though we've been doing really well in identifying people at all exposure sites, I think everyone recognises that we have to do absolutely everything in our power to be able to chase down every single person who might be exposed, because it's that one person who's not found who might be the one who spreads it.
Just before they go on specifically.
That might be one for Jerome as well, but go ahead.
Overall, how are our vaccine supplies going? days people on the phone that they cannot get through?
I appreciate the frustration of people who are really keen to get vaccinated. It's fantastic to see people so keen to get vaccinated. There are limits, and supply is one of them. With hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people have actually called the hotline over the last week. So that's a terrific sign that most of Victoria is ready to get vaccinated tomorrow if they could. There are about 71,000 Pfizer vaccines a week being supplied. That is not expected to increase in the immediate future. So that's a constraint. We will get through that supply on current use, but we can't step up more than that with that current supply. AstraZeneca's supply is less than that, but we know that the second dose for AstraZeneca will be coming online, if you like, for a lot of people in coming weeks. So we'll need to step up the numbers of vaccines with AstraZeneca we give in coming days. We've got constraints at the moment, but the call centre could have 10,000 people on and there'd still be more calls given the demand at the moment. So please be patient, I would say, and if you can't get it today, check back in a week's time. Everyone will get a chance over a period of time, and we'll be in a better place for it. In terms of the online portal, we are working through testing. We want to make sure that it works perfectly well when it comes on, but it's not going to create spots that aren't there already at the moment. We've got pretty full bookings through the call centre. We've got full bookings as people walk in and queue up very patiently as well. So for a lot of people, it'll just be a case of being patient, waiting for that supply to increase in coming weeks and getting a vaccine when the chance comes.
Is the constraint with supply or the logistics of just getting people through the doors? Second, I thought we're supposed to be getting 1 million doses of AstraZeneca a week. We've got fewer than 5,000.
So, look, you'd have to go to the Commonwealth in terms of what the production capacity is for AstraZeneca at the moment. It might be close to 1 million now. A huge number of those are going to GPs, so people should shop around for their vaccine. Look for the GPs who are providing it. You may well get a booking in advance of the mass vaccination centres from the state. So look around and look for something nearby. But the AstraZeneca doses, some are held in reserve, half for that second dose. Same with Pfizer, and a lot are going to GPs. So it's not all about the allocation to state mass vac centres. I'm not sure. I haven't seen that come to HPPC. It might have been published online, but I haven't seen it. Look, I think a lot of people are waiting appropriately, even if it's a couple of hours. We're not seeing huge blowouts in waiting times. Yeah, look, there are clearly some that get to capacity very quickly. Mornings tend to be worse. People should bear that in mind. If they can come at a time when it's a bit quieter, that's a useful thing. You'll get through faster. But it is important to have a look at the waiting times online. Because you might only have to travel another 10 minutes and you'll save an hour in terms of waiting. So there are, a couple of hundred sites stood up, and it is worthwhile looking at the website and shopping around for a place where you can get through easily. Yeah, of course we did. We have to consider the significant challenges, especially to younger kids, as schools close. We're not at a point where we can confidently open schools across the board in metropolitan Melbourne at the moment. The Murdoch Children's Research was really important. They had lots of lessons for what the mitigations in school with ventilation, with mask wearing, with spacing can do. But again, with variants of concern, the landscape has shifted since that report. Singapore has closed schools because they're dealing with the Delta Indian variant that has affected children more significantly, more severe illness and more transmissible with children. So that was in mind as well. But, you know, none of this is easy to choose. We are so aware of the harms across the board, personal, business, economic. It is that awful choice between doing what we know we need to do now for a week versus waiting, letting this get ahead of us and having to choose it for 6 or 8 weeks down the track, which would be so much worse. We know that these are tough times to go through. And for kids missing out on their mates and missing out on that face-to-face learning, which would always be our preference. But we don't want to be in a situation where we've got significant outbreaks in schools, more transmission in the community, and needing to make a choice about a longer period of lockdown because it gets away from us.
You have mentioned the Delta variant there.
The legislation will work through those nuances, but it'll be not dissimilar to some of the exceptions that we saw last year.
Professor, in the answer about schools, you just mentioned the Delta variant. Just to clarify, there's no evidence of that here. We're always talking about the Kappa variant.
That's right. So, look, the Delta and Kappa variants are related. They share many of the same mutations. That, again, that's something for us to bear in mind. But it's also to say that we're not dealing with the same virus as we were last year. And so we need to be alive to the fact that transmission in children might be different, severity in children might be different, but mostly we need to drive this right down to be happy that we can open up. That's right. So Kappa is the B1617.1, the sublineage of the Indian variant, and Singapore is dealing with the more infectious and potentially more dangerous one.
Chief Health Officer, what advice have you given the government as the Chief Health Officer regarding the mental health ramifications of extending lockdown?
So as I've just said, we are so acutely aware of that dilemma. The choice about extending a lockdown now is about avoiding even worse consequences down the track, because transmission is too substantial, gets ahead of us in terms of the case numbers or the number of close contacts. So those harms are so acutely known to us, but you only have, again, you have to look around the world to see what's happened when it's escaped, where transmission just continues with huge numbers affected, and lockdowns that never really ease off, where businesses close for months and months on end, and people are isolated from their loved ones, from their friends for weeks and weeks on end because transmission continues. It's an awful dilemma, but as I say, the dozen countries that had no community transmission for a year and were living life freely are now in lockdown and seeing thousands and thousands of cases. And for some like Thailand, they will not get back to being free of community transmission. And so they've got, those tough choices about how their communities are affected for months and months from now. We don't want to have to face that dilemma in Victoria.
We're not in Thailand.
We're not in Thailand.
Best case scenario for Victoria. We get on top of the community transition this week. What happens next? Are we looking at another 2 weeks of restrictions for Melbourne, another 3 weeks forwards? How slow is this easing out going to be? Best case scenario. I know it's hard to predict, but if we get 0 cases for the next week, what does it look like for Melbourne?
I haven't put my mind to it. I don't expect that we'll get 0 cases for the next week. We will look at the data every day. If there is no transmission whatsoever, if there are no new exposures, if there are no new cases, that will be that will put us in a really good position to ease substantially, but with the recognition that there will still be thousands of people who need to finish their incubation period, who could still become cases, that there still might be unknown chains of transmission who haven't stepped up and gotten tested. Now, I know we're not some of those countries with very substantial transmission, but Taiwan, not a lower middle income country, a pretty developed country, probably got complacent about where they were at. They are facing 10 to 15 deaths per day, 300 new cases per day from nothing. So we have to bear in mind that we're not a special case in Victoria. This is a virus that could take off anywhere in the world. So extending the 5K radius to 10K is really a reflection of some of the feedback through last year that people look to have exercise sometimes in areas beyond that 5K that is safer for them, or that is in an area where it's more appropriate for them to exercise. There are some significantly built up areas in the suburbs, and that 10K for retail purposes where permitted, for food and for exercise is just a little bit easier. It doesn't make a world of difference, I totally recognise that, but for some people it is the difference between exercising in a place that they feel is safer than would otherwise be the case.
Last question, a world of difference to the average individual or to the virus spread?
Well, probably both. I think that, you know, we are comfortable enough that the 10K limit can be in place without significantly increasing the risk.
Professor Sutton, given we now have coronavirus cases in North Melbourne, is there a plan to stop the virus from getting into the housing towers like we saw last year?
Yeah, so there's been work with the towers right through to you know, have awareness of everything in regards to testing, isolation and quarantine, but also we want to prioritise them from a vaccination point of view. Again, I'd encourage them, as for other at-risk populations, to come forward for vaccine, and we want to prioritise them as a group that are at higher risk.
How is that communication? Just in terms of, I guess, getting multicultural leaders to talk to people living in those towers, how's that been so far?
I'd have to get back to you. I know that there's been close engagement, but I'm not aware of the specific details.
Do you know if there's any cases that reside in those?
No, there are no cases in tower complexes at the moment.